Good morning, friends. I welcome you to the fourth lecture series of Unit 4 Non Banking Financial Companies. In this lecture, we will discuss about uh, leasing, meaning and essentials of leasing and types of leasing. Leasing is one of the method of financing a business. Leasing and hire purchase are most important sources of finance for a business to purchase the asset or to acquire the products which are of huge price in nature. Any business or any individual, if he wants to acquire a business, acquire an asset, if the asset value is too high, he may not be able to pay it in single shot, and therefore he may be acquiring it either on lease basis or else on higher purchase basis. So whenever a product is taken on lease basis, right, lease basis, so the lease is an agreement undertaken for an asset, for a specific asset whose value is very high. When the lease is undertaken, the asset is not purchased, but it is taken on rental basis and it is used. After the specific period of time, when the lease agreement overs, the product is given back to the owner and the user will get rid of the contract. So this is what we call as leasing. In case of hire purchase, an asset is acquired by the buyer by paying a specific installments over a period. After the end of this contract period, when he pays the last installment, the buyer becomes the owner of the product. Owner of the product. Take an example of a car which is purchased on hire purchase. When the car owner is say, for example, the car price is 5 lakhs rupees. He pays these 5 lakhs rupees in installments of 50,000 rupees every year. After the last payment of the 50,000 rupees, he becomes the owner. Till then, the owner is the seller of the asset. So this is how there are two different methodologies of the buying an asset, lease contract or hire purchase. Now, this module, especially this fourth module, is focusing upon much on the lease and hire purchase agreements. In this topic, we are going to discuss not only the meanings and understandings about the leasing and hire purchases, meaning, definition, differences, and all that, but also identifying the calculation part of it in this model. In this model, we are going to study whether a business should acquire an asset on leasing basis or hire purchase. If there are two options with the business unit to acquire an asset, there is one option called leasing, another option called buying. Whether buying is beneficial or leasing is beneficial, there we need to calculate and find out the difference. If the buying is good, if how the buying is good, how the leasing is good, that comparison we need to make by calculating the benefits. And one more option is whether the lease is whether an asset can be acquired on lease basis or whether it should be hire purchased instead of buying. There are two methods. So in this case also we need to calculate the benefits and find out in which line there is a more benefit. We have to take that decision. So these problems are there in this uh, chapter. Therefore, please pay attention to understand the basic concepts of leasing and hire purchase. Now, in this model, I am going to discuss only on the lease part because most of the students may not have an idea about the lease, the basic concept of lease, and essential elements of leasing. And at the end, we will discuss about the types of the lease also, but I do not cover these types of the lease, just we will have the list, but each details we will discuss in the next lecture series. Now let us understand what the lease is. What is a lease? Leasing is a contractual agreement between two parties called lessor and lessee, where in lessor, the owner of the property allows its use to lessee, the tenant, for a consideration called rentals, which is paid for a specific period on monthly, quarterly, or yearly. After the lease period is over, the property is owned by the lessor. The period of lease would be less than the life of the asset under the lease. If you read this definition, read this details, you will come to know that lease is an agreement between two parties. One is called lessor and another one is called lessee. Lessor means the owner. Lessor means owner. Lessee means the person who uses the property of the owner, that is a lessors. It is an agreement where the property of the owner, that is lessor's property, is given to the lessee for use, for a use. After using that particular property, after a specific period of time, the property is returned back to the lessor. But while using the property, the lessee, that is the user, is paying a rent on the property to the lessor, to that owner. So owner is a one who transfers, who is a lessor, who undertakes an agreement to transfer the property. Most of the time in businesses, we may not own the assets. We go for the leasing contract. Take for example, if you want to open a shop in a city like Belgaum in a marketplace, okay, where it is not possible for you to buy and construct the shop for you. What you do is, already there are shops where the shop owners are giving you on rental basis. So you enter into a contract of a lease and take that shop for use. So now you become a lessee and the owner become the lessor. When the owner transfers that asset to you to use, you have to pay on monthly basis a rent. Some, it depends on the contract. The contract monthly rentals may be it may be monthly, it may be quarterly, it may be half yearly, or it may be yearly, or in some cases it is 10 years together. The rent is paid in advance and the asset is acquired also. So it depends on the contract where the rentals are paid. So what happens after the specific period of contract? Suppose for example, if you take a shop for 5 years contract, till 5 years, every month you are paying an interest in the month you are paying a rent and using that property. After the fifth year, you are leaving that asset, and who becomes the owner of the asset? The lessor becomes. So in this lease contract, the ownership of the asset does not transfer from the lessor to the lessee, from the lessor to the lessee. So it remains with the lessor only, but the lessee is a beneficiary who uses the property. For using the property, he pays the rental. This contract is called as lease agreement. In businesses, most of these products are acquired. Most of the machineries, heavy machineries and all things are acquired basically by using a lease contract. So in this case, non-banking financial organizations today have developed a concept called financing for the lease. Financing for the lease. Suppose if at all any any person wants to use that particular property, the financial organizations will buy the property and becomes the lessor, and that property is transferred to the given to the use for the particular purpose. That the user, that is called the lessee, pays every year the rentals. After the end of the particular agreement period, the agreement will end by the either by transferring back the ownership of the asset to the lessor, or the purchase will be made by the user, as the agreement may be, as the agreement may be. Or sometimes if the product is obsolete, the lessor may sell it and set right the contract as per the requirements. So this is how the lease agreement is prevailing today. Normally, in most of the businesses, when do we go for the leasing contract? We go for the leasing contract when the asset value is very high, where investing in the asset value becomes locking of the funds in the assets. So most of the business people will think that instead of buying it as a capital, investing a capital in that, they want to use that property under working capital condition. In the day-to-day business, whenever there is an income, so out of that certain portion will be paid for the acquiring the property, where the lease contracts are normally taken into account. We go for the lease contracts. And lease contract is also undertaken in certain situations where the product which you are going to buy may not be useful in future. It is useful for a particular period of time. After that, it may not be useful to you. So therefore, you don't want to buy it. You want to use it. Simple example, if you are, for the purpose of education, if you are staying in Belgaum, and if you want to stay in for the purpose of education, for you are staying for 2 years for completing your MBA, and you want to stay in Belgaum, you may not be able to buy an house to stay for 2 months, because after second year you may not be able to stay in Belgaum. You want to go back to certain other places. So therefore, what you think is, instead of buying the house, even if you have an ability to buy, you don't buy it. You take the house on a lease basis, use it and return it, because unnecessarily investment of capital does not happen. So this is the situation where leasing contracts are involved. It is beneficiary to the businesses when lease is taken. If you buy the property, it is useless for you, because unnecessarily your capital will be locked in a asset which may not be used after particular period of time. So that is why leasing normally is entered into. Leasing is also a suitable situation where the product that you are going to buy becomes obsolete due to change in technology. If the technology changes, if the product becomes obsolete, then it is not useful for you. In such cases also you undergo for example, leasing contract. A simple example is, suppose for example, if you are if a entertainment company wants to use the camera for shooting the programs, or shooting a movie, entertainment company shooting a movie, and the camera is very costly. It may be in terms of lakhs, maybe 25 lakhs rupees camera. But if that camera, if you buy on your own, after a few days, after a few years, the camera becomes obsolete, because new camera will come into existence. So technology will change. So you don't want to take the risk of investment 25 lakhs rupees in a one single shot, because once that camera becomes obsolete, you may not be able to change that camera and buy the new one, and buying new one will be more costly. So in such cases, normally entertainment companies and all that will go for buying a product on lease basis. So what they do is, a big suppliers and all that, they give the camera for lease basis for a specific period of time. You buy the camera, use it, you take the camera, use it, pay the rent and return back after the use. You normally do not acquire, because once you acquire it, it becomes absolute. You may not be able to use it properly. That is how in case of leasing, we normally go for avoiding such kind of risks relating to financial investments. So lease contract is a very essential part of decision making in most of the businesses. If you see the definition as part of your examination requirements, because in examination question will be asked what is leasing, write this definition and also give the explanation which is given above. The definition that we are going to read out here is on leasing is: leasing separates ownership and use as two economic entities and facilitates assets use without ownership. It means this definition clearly defines that leasing contract separates ownership. When you undertake into leasing contract, there are two parties. One is a owner, another one is a user. So the owner transfers the assets to the user and recovers the returns as a rent. Two parties, two economic entities, and facilitates assets without ownership. Without owning the asset, you can use the asset. That is the contract of leasing talks about. So most of the business people find leasing as a best method of financing, best method of adopting for acquiring the assets and all that. Now you see what are the characteristics or essentials elements of the lease. That is, first one is parties to the contract. Normally for a leasing contract there are two parties. One party is the owner, the another party is the user. Owner is called as a lessor and user is called as lessee. User is called as lessee, lessor and lessee. The second one is assets are involved under lease contract. Normally, assets are you are involved under lease contract, not the services and all that. We do not get the services on lease contract, but we normally involve the assets. And the assets which we are involving under the contract are normally of a huge price. Normally of a huge price. For example, the building. For example, the cars. For example, the ship. So these are the assets whose price is very high. And if you take a decision to buy these assets for your business, maximum amount of capital is locked in these assets only. So you may not be able to get the working capital for your business. That is why you normally take these products on lease, and after the completion of that particular period and all that, you will return it or you renew the contract as per the requirement. For example, if you are staying in a rented house in Belgaum, you pay the rent every month for a specific period of agreement. Say agreement is for 3 years. After third year, if you want to stay in the house again, either you will what you do is you renew the contract for next 3 years, next 5 years. And in that cases, in case of a new agreement, the lessor may charge you little higher the rent, and you are ready to pay that, and you undertake into that contract. So this contract is renewed and the asset is withheld in the business for a continuous period of usage. So this is how assets are involved, and that to the assets whose value is very huge are normally involved in a lease contract. The third one is ownership is spread from separate from user. In case of ownership is concerned, the ownership lies with the lessor, that is the owner of the asset. It never comes to the user at any point of time in lessor. In certain cases, at the end of the contract, if the contract ends with the transfer of ownership, then lease will come to an end and the buyer becomes the owner. So in the beginning itself, till the end of the contract, the ownership lies always with the uh, lessor, always with the lessor. So ownership is separated from the user. User never becomes the owner in case of lease contract. And therefore, when he does not become the owner of the asset, there are certain advantages that he enjoys. Who? The user, because he is not the owner. That is why he enjoys certain power. One is, because he is not the owner, he is not supposed to spend money for the maintenance of that particular asset. He need not require to spend unnecessarily money for maintaining the business. For example, if you are staying in a rented house, any kinds of repair, any kinds of alterations to be made, normally it is made by the owner. The headache of all that maintenance of the asset lies with the owner. That is one. Second one is, if the depreciation happens, on the asset, the depreciation responsibility lies with the owner. It never comes to the buyer at any condition. Depreciations are felt by the suffered by the owner of the asset, that is lessor in this case. So therefore, user is totally free from all this because the ownership lies with the lessor, and it never comes to the lessee at any condition in the lease contract. But in case of hire purchase, the ownership will be transferred automatically from the buyer to the from the seller to the buyer. So this is how that we will discuss when we are discussing the hire purchases. The fourth one is term of lease. There are two types of terms of lease. Lease can be for a short period of time. Lease can be for a long period of time. For some assets, lease can be short period of time. If the asset's value is depleting, value is reducing, can be even for a small term also. For example, you can take the, so you might have understood that banks and some of the transporting agencies may not buy the cars for the use of their executives, for the use of their businesses. What they do is bankers normally take cars on lease basis. On lease basis, the owner of the car undertakes an agreement with the banks, and he provides the car to the bank for using for their executives and all that, for executive transportation and all that. The officers of the bank uses the car, but the bank never becomes the owner. The contract will be for a short period of time because the life of the car is hardly 5 to 7 years, maybe 10 years. So before the expiry of the life of the car, the lease contract will normally end. So this is for a short period, maybe for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, depending on the car value and usage values and all that. After that particular period of time, the owner will take away the car from that. So till the usage of the car, banks normally pay the rents on the car. So they normally never own the cars, because owning a car becomes a unnecessary investment in the business. That's why rental is more cheaper for them in usage of the cars and all that. So this is what we call as short term. In certain cases, the lease contract may be long term also. For example, there are certain kinds of businesses where if you are buying the building, if the bank is getting a building for its branches, in all the branches, bank may not be able to buy the building. The building, its main head office may be owned, building may be owned by the bank, but when it opens the branches in all over the country, every branch is not invested to purchase. They will not buy the buildings. They may go for the lease contract, but the lease contract may be for a long period of time, maybe 10 to 20 years. Sometimes it is 50 years. Sometimes the lease contract can even be 999 years, that is 100 years near. So like that, they will take that particular contract, and the lessee is not cannot terminate the contract till the contract is over. So in case of long term contracts and all that, the usage will be made by the less user for a long period of time. Now the next fifth one is the another character is lease rental. Always rent is fixed on the lease asset. It may be changing after a specific period of time as per the agreement. Now the rent is paid by the user to the owner of the asset. So lessor receives the rent from the lessee for transferring the assets for using by the lessee. So that is how rental exists in this case. And if you see the mode of termination of this lease contract, how a lease contract will come to an end. Normally lease contract will come to an end with the three types of results, any one among the results depending on the contract. One is the first one is renewal of the contract after expiry of the lease. Say for example, if the lease is taken for 5 years, after fifth year, if the owner wants to continue the contract, he will end the old contract and renew the contract with the new terms and agreements, like that. So a lease contract will come to after the expiry with a renewal of the contract. This is called renewal. Normally in uh, urban areas and city areas, the contracts on house rental contracts normally for 11 months. They even not go for 1 year. After 11th year, because the maintenance of the asset is more with the owner, that's why he wanted to renew the rent contracts. Therefore he will give the contract for 11 months. After 11 months, again that contract is renewed for next 11 months, where the fresh agreements are made on the rental values and other things. So this is how normally takes into contract. The second one, terminating the contract, is return of the asset to the lessor after completion. It is a when the completion of the this happens, you are returning back to the asset to the owner. A contract will automatically come to an end. The third one is lessor sells the asset to the lessee. There are certain contracts where they, at the end, the lessee may sell the assets to the lessee and recover the basic price of that. That can also be in terminating the contract. Certain times you might have seen some people who are staying for a long period of time in the house for 10 years, 20 years. When the owner becomes a requirement of the funds and all that, he may sell that asset to the lessee only. When the lessee purchases the asset, the contract of lease contract will come to an end. So these are the various things. So we will see the remaining aspects, that is types of the lease. I think there are various types of the lease. Depending upon the nature of the lease, we can classify the lease contracts into different types. The first type is extent to which the risks and rewards of the ownership is transferred. How the ownership risk is transferred, based on that we will calculate, like a financial lease and operating lease. Financial lease and operating lease, very important part while you are calculating the lease agreement cost and all, cost of the lease agreement and all that, for comparing whether to buy an asset or not. So these two types of leases are important. We'll discuss them in detail in the next lecture. We will not touch them now, because it takes a lot of time to discuss and understand. So financial lease and operating lease, we will discuss it later on. Now, depending on the number of parties to the contract transaction, in the case of lease, we have sale and lease back, sale and lease back, and direct and indirect lease, direct and indirect lease, sale and lease back, and direct and lease. All these we will discuss in the next chapters only. And depending on the sale and lease back, in the sense that the product is sold to somebody, it is sold to somebody. What I do is, I buy this, see, being a user, I know which asset is necessary for me. Suppose, for example, a sugar industry wanted a particular crushing machine, and it is used only by the sugar industry. In this case, what the sugar industry will do is, it will uh, buy that machine, and when he buys the machine, huge amount is invested, and if it is not able to get that money back, therefore after buying that, it sells that particular asset to a particular financial institution. Particular financial institution buys it and sells it. So who is the real purchaser? Real purchaser is not the sugar industry, real purchaser is a bank. But buying and selling happens basically because the nature of the product which has to be used is decided by the user. That is why the sugar industry will buy that asset and sells back to the uh, finance organization. Financial organization will pay the money. Who is the buyer? Actually, buyer is the financial institution only, but the decision of buying and selecting the product lies with the sugar factory, and the financing is made by the financial institution. Now the financial institution becomes owner. Here the asset is bought and sold back to financial institute, and financial institution in its name gives that asset to use to that particular sugar industry which buys it, So this is what we call as sale and lease back. Selling and leasing it back. Again, the sugar industry takes the asset on lease basis. Understand the concept? Purchasing an asset and informing this financial institution to pay the money, and using that asset again. So it is buying and sale and lease back. So this is the concept of that. In certain situation, it arises. Next one is direct and indirect lease. Direct lease, in the sense, directly you are taking the asset from the lessor. Indirect, in the sense, the lessor is also not sometimes indirect lease. The lessee may certain times use that asset to lease it to somebody else. So it is an indirect lease. Real owner is a different, but lessee himself acts like the owner and gives that particular product to other person for usage. An example is indirect lease. For example, if the hotel is taken on rental basis, big hotel by the hotel investor is taken on lease basis from somebody else, the hotel owner is the big landlord. From that, the constructed hotel is taken, and rooms are given on rental basis by the uh, person who gets the hotel in his custody, person who is invested in the hotel business. So it is what you call as direct and indirect lease. So in this case, the person who stays in the hotel, for whom, who is the lessor? Lessor is the hotel, what you call as a business person. But real lessor is not even the hotel owner also, it is the uh, landlord who gives the hotel. So there are three types of parties in the direct and indirect lease. Directly you can take the lease from the lessor to the lessee. Sometimes intermediaries are also involved in getting the lease contracts. So that is what we call as direct and indirect lease. In that direct and indirect lease, there are two types of parties: one bipartite lease, and second one is tripartite lease. In bipartite lease, there are only two parties, lessor and lessee. So lessor gives that product to the lessee. Where in tripartite, as I said, there are two owners. There are two owners, third parties using it. That is what tripartite. Third one is domicile of the lessor. Based on that, we have two types of lease contracts. Based on the domicile, we have two types of contracts. One is domestic lease and cross-border lease. Domestic lease in the sense, the owner, both the owner, lessor and lessee, both the parties stays in the same country and the lease happens. That is what we call as domestic lease. In case of cross-border lease, one party lives in the foreign country, maybe lessor or lessee, and the other party stays in the another country. So the contract happens. This is called cross-border lease. So these are the various types of lease. We will see the remaining aspects in the next class. I thank you. Thank you for your patience listening. Please pay attention in understanding the perfect concept of lease. Otherwise, once you have clear, if you don't have clarities relating to this, further discussions becomes very difficult. Kindly watch this video again and again and understand the concept better. I wish you all the best.